The sound came every night after the men fell asleep. Tap, 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 small, steady, patient as a heartbeat. It came from the little room behind the kitchen of a log cabin that sat on the shoulder of a mountain in Colorado Territory, where the pines grew so thick they swallowed sound and the granite peaks cut into the sky like the teeth of a saw. October wind pushed through the gaps between the wall logs, and the fire in the main hearth had burned down to a red coal glow that painted the low ceiling the color of rust. Three men slept in the cabin's main room. Canton Bridger lay on the bed nearest the front door, on his back, one hand resting on his chest, the other hanging over the side of the mattress, close enough to the floorboards that his knuckles nearly touched the rifle propped against the bed frame. Even in sleep, his body held the posture of a man who expected trouble. The long scar down his right forearm caught the ember light. He was 33 years old and had spent the last 8 of those years building this place with his own hands, and he slept like a man guarding what he had built. Rufus Bridger, his younger brother, slept on the bed by the window. Curled on his side, blanket pulled to his shoulder mouth, slightly open. On the small table beside him sat a wilted Edelweiss blossom in a carved wooden cup. He had picked it yesterday afternoon and forgotten to replace it. Rufus was 28. He forgot things because his mind was always moving forward, always looking for the next good thing, the next reason to believe that tomorrow would be better than today. He was the one who had placed the advertisement in the St. Louis newspaper. Two brothers seeking a wife. Peaceful life, honest labor. He had written it himself and paid for 2 weeks of printing, and when Canton found out, the silence between them lasted 3 days. Shepard Farrow slept in a hammock strung between 2 support columns. Folded at an angle, one arm dangling, his left hand hanging loose in the dark. On his ring finger, a thin copper band turned slowly. Even in sleep, his thumb found the ring and rotated it. Unconscious. Automatic. Like a second pulse, he could not stop. Shep was 36. He had come to this mountain with the Bridger brothers 8 years ago after California took everything from all 3 of them. The ring was his wife, Nell's. She had been dead for 8 years, and the ring had not left his finger for a single day since. Tap, tap, tap. In the small room behind the kitchen, the room that Rufus had swept and scrubbed and furnished with a pine bed and a grass-stuffed mattress and a vase of wild tulips, 2 months before Jessamine Alder sat on the wooden floor with her back against the wall and her mother's wedding dress spread across her lap. A needle was in her right hand, but she was not sewing anything new. A tallow candle burned on a tin plate beside her, its small flame throwing just enough light to illuminate the lining of the dress. Yellowed linen, old thread, patterns that looked at first glance like the kind of decorative stitching that any skilled seamstress might put inside a garment. Flowers and swirls, curving lines and clusters of tiny knots. But Jess was not admiring her mother's handiwork. Her left hand moved across the linen surface, touching, pausing, sliding forward, touching again. The chain stitch that curved along the left side of the panel represented a contour line at 2,400 feet. The satin stitch that ran horizontally across the center was a stream flowing east to west. The cluster of French knots in the lower right corner, so small they looked like seed pearls from the outside, was the marker Father had used for every significant find in his career. An X, the location of the mine. Jess stopped. Her fingertip rested on the cluster of French knots. She looked up through the small window of her room and saw the mountainside outside. Granite, gray under the thin October moon. The ridgeline cut against the sky in a pattern she knew better than her own reflection, because she was looking at the same ridgeline that her mother had stitched into this dress nearly 20 years ago. She was sitting inside the map. The Bridger Ranch sat less than half a day's ride from the largest undiscovered silver deposit in Colorado Territory. And she, Jessamine Alder, 22 years old, orphaned running, was the only person alive who knew exactly where it was. Footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, even. Canton going to the water bucket in the middle of the night. He did this every night, the habit of a man who did not sleep well and would not admit it. Jess rolled the dress, quickly pushed it under her pillow. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Her right hand found the silver thimble on her finger and squeezed. The thimble had been her mother's. It was the last thing Emmeline Alder had placed in her daughter's hand before the consumption took her 12 years ago in a bedroom that smelled of lavender and grief. Canton's footsteps passed her door. Did not slow, did not pause. She heard the wooden ladle hit the bucket, heard the water splash, heard his footsteps return, then silence. Jess exhaled. She pulled the dress from under the pillow and held it against her chest. Outside the window, the wind carried the smell of damp leaves and early frost. The maples on the lower slopes had already turned gold. Higher up, the aspens were bare, and on the peaks above the tree line, the snow had crept down another 100 feet since last week. Rufus had told her just days ago. 6 weeks until the first real snowfall. After that, the trail down to Elk Creek would close. No one up, no one down. For 4 months, 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks to decide everything. Just turned the thimble on her finger. Slowly, counting. She did not know yet what she would do with the map. She did not know yet that a man named Gideon Polk was already in Colorado, already asking questions, already following the trail she had tried so hard to erase. She did not know that the man sleeping in the hammock 20 feet from her door would become the most dangerous person in her life. Not because he was cruel, because he was in pain. And pain, she would learn, could turn a good man into a thief faster than greed ever could. All she knew in this moment was the sound of the needle against linen. Tap, tap, tap. And the mountain outside her window holding its secret under stone in silence, waiting for someone to decide whether it would be a blessing or a curse. She bent her head. She kept reading. 10 weeks earlier, in the middle of July, Jessamine Alder had stood in the ruins of her father's study in Saint Yvon. Lewis had made the decision that brought her here. The room had been destroyed, every drawer yanked open, every cabin emptied, every box pried apart. Survey maps were scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Her father's compass lay on its side near the baseboard, the glass cracked. His notebook's 20 years of meticulous geological observations recorded in small, precise handwriting had been torn from their bindings and tossed in piles. The smell of cigar smoke still hung in the air. Aldis's brand, Dominican tobacco, expensive sharp, the smell of her uncle. Jess stood in the middle of the wreckage with her hands clutching the fabric of her skirt and her jaw locked tight. Her eyes were red but dry. She had used up her tears at her father's funeral nearly 2 months before. Prosper Alder, cartographer and geological surveyor, dead of pneumonia at 57. The coughing had started in March. By late May, he was gone. She could still hear Aldis's voice through the wall from 2 hours ago, when he and Vernon had ransacked the house while they thought she was sleeping upstairs. The map has to be somewhere. Prosper was not the kind of man who kept secrets without writing them down. The girl knows. Ask her. She won't talk, Aldous. Then make her talk. That mine is worth a fortune, Vernon. A fortune. Make her talk. Her own uncle, her father's brother, a man who had sat in the front pew at Prosper's funeral with tears on his face and a hymnal in his hands, and who had within 2 weeks of the burial begun tearing apart the dead man's house, looking for a piece of paper that he believed would make him rich. Jess looked at the wardrobe. The door stood open, her father's clothes pulled out and heaped on the floor. But in the far corner, on an old wooden hook, hung the one item no one had touched: her mother's wedding dress. White cotton, round collar, long sleeves, handmade lace trim that Emmeline had tatted herself in the weeks before the ceremony. The hem was frayed. The lace had faded from white to ivory to the color of old paper. The linen lining had gone yellow with age. No one had touched it because who searches the old dress of a woman dead for 12 years? No one except the woman's daughter. Who knew what was hidden inside? Jess took the dress from the hook. She folded it carefully the way her mother had taught her to fold delicate fabric, rolling rather than creasing, pressing the air out gently. She placed it in the bottom of her valise beneath her clothes, beneath her sewing kit, beneath the spools of thread, and the packet of needles that were the tools of her trade and the inheritance of her mother's art. Then she closed the valise and walked out the back door of the house where she had grown up. The street was quiet, dawn light, gray sky. And at the corner of Olive Street, leaning against a lamppost with a newspaper in his hands, a man in a gray coat. He was not reading the newspaper. He was watching her. Jess had seen him 3 times in the past week, at the market on Tuesday, outside the church on Thursday, and now here at 6 in the morning, pretending to read a paper that she could see even from this distance was 3 days old. Aldis's detective. The first one. There would be others. She did not run. Running attracted attention. She walked at a steady pace to the train station, her valise in one hand and her mother's thimble on her finger, and she bought a ticket under the name Jessamine Ward. In her coat pocket was a clipping from a newspaper folded so many times the creases had gone soft. An advertisement she had found not by accident, not by luck, but by searching through every mail-order bride listing in every paper she could find until she located the one that matched the geography she needed. Two brothers seeking a wife, ranch in the mountains of Colorado Territory. Peaceful life, honest labor. Right to R. Bridger, Elk Creek, Colorado. She had studied the map of Colorado Territory that hung on the wall of the station. She had found Elk Creek. She had located the mountains west of the town, and she had compared that location with the map she had memorized thread by thread from hundreds of nights spent reading her mother's stitching by candlelight. The regions matched. The Bridger Ranch sat within the area that the map indicated, close enough to reach the mine on foot, close enough to confirm what her father had found 20 years ago and then walked away from, and close enough to decide finally what to do with the secret that had haunted her family, killed her father's peace of mind, and was now putting her own life in danger. Jess bought a ticket to Denver. From Denver, she would take a stagecoach to Elk Creek. From Elk Creek, she would walk up a mountain trail to a ranch she had never seen, to meet men she had never spoken to begin a life she had not chosen out of love or hope, but out of calculation. On the platform, she turned one last time. St. Louis disappeared behind the smoke of the locomotive. She turned the thimble on her finger. She did not cry my. She counted. Every mile between herself and Aldous was a mile of safety. Every mile toward Colorado was a mile closer to the mine. And every mile was a mile deeper into a lie that she would have to maintain perfectly among strangers until she decided whether the treasure her father had died protecting was worth keeping or worth destroying. The train pulled away. The counting continued. The stagecoach from Elk Creek left her at the end of the road, where the dirt track turned to mountain trail and the land tilted upward into pine forest and gray stone. October wind carried the smell of pine resin and wet rock. Clouds sat low on the peaks, heavy and gray, as if the mountain were wearing a hat pulled down over its eyes. Jess picked up her valise and began to walk. Her shoes were city shoes, thin-soled, and they slipped on the loose stone. The trail climbed steeply, her calves burned. Her breath came short in the thin mountain air. But she did not stop. She had come too far to stop now. Around a bend in the trail, leaning against a ponderosa pine with his hands in his pockets, and a spray of purple asters tucked into the pocket of his faded work shirt, stood Rufus Bridger. He saw her and his face opened like a window letting in the morning. A wide, honest grin. No reserve, no calculation, no holding back. "Hello there. I'm Rufus Bridger. You must be Miss Ward. Lord, this trail is brutal. I keep telling my brother we should clear some of these rocks, but he says leave it, whoever can make it up deserves to. He says that about most things." Jess, cautious but exhausted, managed a small nod. "Jessamine? People call me Jess." Rufus took the valise from her hand without asking, as naturally as if he had been carrying her things his whole life. He started up the trail, talking the entire way. "Your room is at the end of the hall. Window looks out over the creek. I put flowers on the table. Wild tulips. Don't know if you like them. If you don't, I'll pick something else. There's no shortage of flowers on this mountain." The ranch appeared around the last bend, like something that had grown out of the mountain itself. A two-story log cabin, solidly built, not beautiful but strong, wooden fence all around, a cattle shed behind, a small workshop off to the side, and in front of the cabin door, running along the path like a welcome mat made of color, a row of wildflowers. Purple asters, yellow coneflowers, blue columbine. Rufus had planted them. Canton Bridger stood on the porch. He was leaning against a post. He had planned himself an axe resting against the railing beside him. His gray-blue eyes found Jess immediately and did what they always did with anything new. They measured, they assessed, they looked for structural weaknesses. He did not smile, he did not frown. A short nod. "Canton, your room is behind the kitchen. Has its own door." That was all. He glanced at the valise and Rufus's hand glanced at Jess, then looked past her down the trail. Checking, looking for anyone who might have followed. Seeing no one, he turned and went inside. Then Shepherd Farrow stepped out of the workshop. He was taller than both brothers, leaner. His black hair showed threads of silver at the temples, early for a man of 36, but his face had the look of someone who had earned every gray hair and remembered the cost of each one. Machine grease darkened his fingertips and lined the creases of his palms. A rag hung over one shoulder. He smiled at Jess, and the smile was charming, quick, easy. But there was something behind it that did not quite match, like a note played slightly flat in an otherwise pleasant melody. Shepherd Pharaoh, people call me Shep. I fix everything on this ranch except Canton's temperament. He winked. Jess looked at the three men. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the mountain range rising behind it, granite and pine peak after peak disappearing into the low clouds. It's a beautiful ranch, Canton's voice came from inside the doorway. Ranch is still being built. Beautiful is not the word yet. Rufus leaned close to Jess and lowered his voice. He's always like that. Don't worry. The room was small, a pine bed with a mattress stuffed with dried grass, a small table, a narrow wardrobe, a window that looked out over a creek where the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. On the table in a little wooden vase, a single wild tulip, purple and white. Rufus had placed it there. Jess locked the door, opened her valise, lifted the dress from the bottom. Carefully, gently, the way you carry something that is both your greatest treasure and your greatest danger. She hung it in the back corner of the wardrobe behind her coat, where the shadows would hide it from a casual glance. Then she stood at the window and looked west. The mountain slope rose steeply, covered in pine and aspen, and higher up bare rock. Half a day's walk, maybe less. Beneath those gray stone faces inside the belly of the mountain lay the largest silver deposit ever found in Colorado territory, and no one knew. Not the Bridger brothers, not the people in Elk Creek, not the mining companies that had spent fortunes searching these ranges for exactly this kind of strike. Only Jess, 22, alone, running. She turned the thimble on her finger. The silver caught a sliver of afternoon light and held it. She was not here by accident. She had chosen this ranch, this advertisement, this specific location, because it sat within the region her mother's map described. She needed to be close enough to the mine to compare the embroidered map with the actual terrain, to confirm that her father's discovery was real, and then to decide, keep the secret or destroy it. Her father's last words to her, spoken from a sickbed in a room that smelled of camphor and approaching death, had been about the dress. The dress is the last thing I'm leaving you, Jessamine Victorian. Don't sell it, and don't let anyone see the stitching inside. She had promised, and she had kept the promise. And the promise had become a chain, and the chain had followed her from St. Louis to Denver, to Elk Creek, to this room on this mountain. And she did not yet know whether she would break it or whether it would break her. She closed the wardrobe door. She sat on the bed. She breathed. That first evening, the four of them sat around a rough pine table and ate venison stew with hard bread and black coffee. Jess watched. Canton ate quickly, mechanically cleaned his own plate, and went out to the porch without a word. He sat alone in the dark and did not come back inside for an hour. Rufus talked. He told Jess about the cow named Esther, who had a sore foot and needed to be kept off rocky ground for a week. About the deer that had come down to the creek that morning, 6 of them does, and fawns drinking in a line. About how this autumn was prettier than last autumn, more color in the aspens, more gold in the light. Shep sat tilted back in his chair, the copper ring turning on his finger, smiling at Rufus's stories. But his eyes were not resting. They moved around the room, touching objects, touching corners, touching Jess. Not staring, scanning. The way a mechanic scans an engine looking for the part that does not fit. Jess felt his gaze. She was not frightened by it, but she noted it, filed it away, added it to the inventory of observations she was building, thread by careful thread, about each of these men and what they might become to her. Allies, friends, or threats. On the third day, Jess established a rule that none of the men had expected. She would not allow anyone to enter her room when she was not present. Canton needed to repair the window hinge. It was rusted, the window would not close properly, and cold air was leaking in at night. A practical problem with a practical solution. I need to get into your room to fix that hinge, he said. I'll be in the room while you work, Jess replied. Canton looked at her. 1 beat. 2. His gray-blue eyes read her the way they read a beam of wood looking for the grain, the stress points, the reason it held together or fell apart. He did not ask why. "All right," he said. He came in with a small hammer brass nails and a replacement hinge he had forged himself. 10 minutes of work. He did not speak. His hands moved with economy and precision, the hands of a man who had spent 8 years learning exactly how much force each material required and never wasted a single stroke. When he finished, his eyes swept the room once. A carpenter's habit, checking corners, checking joints, checking the wardrobe door that was closed tight and revealed nothing. Done. No more draft. He left. Jess exhaled. That same afternoon, Rufus made a small mistake that would later become a large problem. He opened Jess's door while she was down at the creek, wanting only to swap out the wilting tulips for fresh asters. He saw the dress, hanging in the corner of the wardrobe, white cotton, an old lace, gentle and faded and completely unremarkable. He mentioned it to Shep in the yard. She brought a wedding dress with her. Her mother's, I think. Sweet, isn't it? Shep was sharpening a knife on a whetstone. His hand stopped. The blade rested on the stone, motionless. An old wedding dress? Who brings an old wedding dress up a mountain? Rufus shrugged. Someone who misses her mother. Maybe, Shep said. He went back to sharpening, but on his left hand the copper ring began to turn faster. In her first week at the ranch, Jessamine Alder proved her worth with needle and thread. She mended Canton's work trousers. 2 patches at the knees stitched with thread that matched the fabric so precisely that the repair was invisible. She fixed the torn canvas on Rufus's saddle, using a saddle stitch so tight and even that it held stronger than the original rivets. She added a border to the kitchen curtains, hemming the frayed edges with linen and transforming the window from something that looked neglected into something that looked intentional. The 3 men watched her hands as she worked. Quick, accurate, each motion deliberate, nothing wasted, every stitch placed with the confidence of someone who had been sewing since before she could write her own name. Canton studied the repair on his trousers one morning, turning the fabric in his rough hands, looking for the join. You sew faster than I nail. Jess glanced up from the saddle canvas. My father used to say that sewing and building were the same thing. Both are just connecting pieces that were apart. Canton considered this. Then he did something he almost never did. He nodded. Not the quick, functional nod he gave to acknowledge a completed task. A slower nod, a nod of agreement, of recognition. The first time in Jess's presence that he had conceded a point to another person. Every morning, Rufus brought Jess a flower, different each day. Purple asters on Monday, blue columbine on Tuesday, red Indian paintbrush on Wednesday. A wild rose, small and white, with a scent that reminded Jess of something she could not name on Thursday. Jess never commented on the flowers, but she did something with each one that Rufus noticed. She opened an old copy of Pilgrim's Progress that she had found on the kitchen shelf, and she pressed the flower between its pages, carefully, flattening the petals, preserving the color. Rufus saw her do this with the third flower, and his eyes changed. Not just happy, something deeper, something that came from the part of him that had planted wildflowers along the cabin path, because his mother had always said that a house without flowers was not a house but only 4 walls and a roof. His flowers were being kept. One afternoon, as Jess pressed an aster between the pages of the book, Rufus lingered in the doorway. How will you know when you have been here long enough? He asked. Jess smoothed the page over the pressed flower. When this book is full of flowers, I'll know I've been here long enough to call this place home. Rufus smiled. That book has a lot of pages. During the day, while the 3 men worked, Jess took walks. Canton felled timber on the north slope, preparing logs for a new section of fence before winter. Rufus tended the cattle, checking hooves, counting heads, talking to each animal by name. Shep worked in his forge workshop, sharpening tools, repairing hinges, doing the meticulous metalwork that kept the ranch functioning. And Jess walked, not aimlessly, not for pleasure, though that is what anyone watching would have assumed. She walked with a purpose that she kept hidden behind the appearance of a young woman enjoying the mountain scenery. Inside her head, memorized from hundreds of nights of tracing her mother's stitching, was the map. Every contour line, every stream, every landmark. And now, step by step, she was comparing that map to the land itself. On her first walk, she found the stream. The chain stitch on the dress had shown it running east to west, and here it was cutting through a meadow below the ranch, the water clear and cold, carrying the faint mineral scent of granite. Her father had told her once that water near silver deposits often ran cleaner than water elsewhere, because native silver did not dissolve in cold mountain streams. On her third walk, she found the Arrowhead Rock. The satin stitch on the dress had indicated a triangular formation pointing west, and here it stood. A granite wall gray and green with moss shaped by centuries of erosion into a form that looked unmistakably like the head of an arrow, pointing west, toward the interior of the mountain. On her fifth walk, she found the oak grove. The dense cluster of cross stitches on the dress had marked this as the entry point, and here the oaks stood like ancient sentinels, their trunks thick enough to require 3 arms to encircle their leaves already turning from green to gold in the October light. And behind the grove, hidden by undergrowth and shadow, she found the rock fissure, a narrow cleft in the stone barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, concealed by brush and overhanging branches. She stood at the mouth of the fissure, darkness inside, and a smell, cold metal and wet stone. The smell her father had described to her in the careful, precise language of a geologist. The smell that meant minerals, that meant ore, that meant something valuable buried in the bones of the earth. She did not go in. She stood still. Her fingers found the thimble and turned it slowly. Then she turned around and walked back to the ranch. Faster than she had come, her heart beating hard, her mind counting, always counting. Now she knew where the mine was. The question that remained was what she would do with that knowledge. In her second week at the ranch, Jess rode down to Elk Creek with Rufus to buy supplies. Flour and salt and lamp oil and thread. The town was small, a general store, a post office, a saloon, a wooden church, the kind of town that existed to serve the ranches and mining camps in the surrounding mountains and did not pretend to be anything more. At the general store, an old man sat in a wooden chair on the front porch. Horace Tull, 70 years old. His hands trembled and his eyes were clouded with the beginnings of cataracts, but his back was straight and his voice when he spoke carried the authority of a man who had spent half a century reading the earth. He had been a miner. Clear Creek, Central City, Leadville. He had dug ore from the ground when Colorado was still a territory, and the mountains were full of men who believed that the next strike would make them kings. Now he lived on a small pension and a large supply of memories, and he sat on the porch of the general store most days because it was the only place where anyone still asked him questions. Jess walked out of the store with a sack of flour in her arms, and Horace Tull looked at her, and he did not stop looking. His voice, when it came, was rough with age and something else, something like recognition. "You have the eyes of Prosper Alder." Jess froze. Her hands tightened on the flour sack until her knuckles went white. Horace nodded slowly. His clouded gaze drifted past her, past the town, past the present, into a place 20 years gone. "I knew Prosper, 20 years back. He surveyed this region for Consolidated Mining. Best man I ever saw at Reading Rock. He could look at a cliff face the way other men read a book. He saw what was inside." Jess set the flour sack down carefully. Her voice was low and controlled. "You knew my father." "I did." Horace was quiet for a moment. The wind blew dust along the street. "Prosper found something in these mountains. I never knew exactly what, but after his last survey trip he changed. Canceled his contract with the Consolidated, packed up, went back to St. Louis. Before he left, he said something to me." He stopped. The silence filled with wind and the creak of the porch boards. He said, "Horace, there are things you find that are better forgotten, because if you keep them, they will kill more people than they feed." Jess stood perfectly still. She felt the tears before she could stop them, felt them rise and blur her vision, and she wiped them away quickly with the back of her hand. Horace watched her. His eyes were clouded, but they were not blind. He saw her father in the set of her jaw, and the way she held her shoulders straight and rigid, carrying weight. "You are Prosper's daughter. I can see him in your eyes. He was a good man. I hope you are the same." Jess swallowed. "I am trying, sir." Horace nodded, once closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. He did not speak again. On the wagon ride back up the mountain, Jess was silent. Rufus sat beside her holding the reins, and he did not ask what was wrong. He simply reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a yellow cone flower he had picked that morning, and placed it in her hand. Jess held the flower. She did not press it into the book. She held it in her hand and all the way home, and when she finally let go of it on the kitchen table that evening, the petals had left a faint yellow stain on her palm, like a mark that the mountain had placed on her skin to remind her that she had been seen. One morning, Jess woke and realized that the draft in her room was gone. She sat up, looked at the window. Something was different. She got out of bed, went close, and ran her fingers along the frame. New wood. Pine freshly cut and planed fitted tight against the original frame to seal the gaps where cold air had been leaking in. The work was precise. Clean joints, smooth surfaces, no rough edges. Canton had done this. During the night, while she slept. Without asking, without telling her, without expecting thanks. She went to the kitchen. Canton was already gone, his axe and his silence taken up the slope to the timber stand where he cut wood every morning. The coffee pot sat on the stove, still warm. That afternoon, Jess placed a cup of hot coffee on the fence post where Canton always stopped after hauling logs. The spot where he would set down the axe, wipe his forehead with his sleeve, and stand for a moment looking at the work he had done. Canton came down the slope, saw the cup, picked it up, looked toward the kitchen window. Jess stood in the window he had fixed. Their eyes met across 30 feet of mountain air. Canton nodded once, drank the coffee, said nothing. He had fixed her window because he noticed the cold getting in and could not leave a problem unsolved. She had left him coffee because she noticed what he had done and could not leave it unacknowledged. Neither said a word about it. Neither needed to. The exchange was complete. Fixed window for hot coffee. Care answered by care. In a language that had no vocabulary except action. The first frost came on a Tuesday morning in the middle of October. Rufus pointed at the silver coating on the meadow grass. First frost, October already. 4 weeks until snow. He looked up at the peaks. The snow line, which had been sitting on the very top of the mountains when Jess arrived in August, had crept down. Noticeably. The white had moved closer like a curtain being slowly lowered over a window. In his workshop, Shep was preparing for winter. Sharpening axes, repairing the snow shovel, checking the locks on the cattle shed doors. He mentioned to the others at supper that they had lost 5 head of cattle last winter because they ran out of stored feed. We have to prepare earlier this year, he said, and the copper ring turned on his finger, and his dark eyes moved to the window where the mountain stood against the sky like a wall between them and the rest of the world. The countdown had begun, though no one had named it yet. Every week the snow line dropped. Every week the air grew colder. Every week the window of time in which anyone could leave the mountain or arrive on it grew narrower. The day Canton saw Jess reading rock was the day something shifted between them. She was on one of her walks. He was cutting timber at the edge of the forest a quarter-mile from the ranch. He saw her through the trees standing before a rock face, and something about the way she stood caught his attention. She was not looking at the rock the way most people looked at rock. She was studying it. Her head tilted at an angle. Her fingers touched the surface, tracing the lines and veins in the stone. Her eyes moved methodically left to right, top to bottom, the way a person reads a page. Canton set down his axe and walked toward her. "You know something about rock." Jess startled, then composed herself. "My father was a geological surveyor. He taught me to identify rock types and read formations. Old habit." Canton came closer. He looked at the rock face. Gray granite, quartz veins running diagonally, mica flecks catching the light. He had passed this rock 1,000 times in 8 years and never once considered what it might be telling him. "I've lived here 8 years and I never looked at rock that way." Jess turned to face him. "You look at wood, I look at stone. It is the same thing, reading the material." Canton held her gaze. This was not the quick assessing glance he gave to new fence posts. This was something else. Surprise, Boa. And underneath the surprise, a recognition he had not expected. He had never met anyone who spoke about materials the way he did. With respect, with knowledge, with the understanding that every piece of the natural world had its own language, and that learning to read it was not a skill, but a form of listening. "You are more interesting than I expected," he said. "So are you," she replied. They walked back toward the ranch, the same direction, a few paces apart, in silence, and the silence was not awkward. It was the silence of two people who had just discovered that they understood something about each other that did not require words. Every night the needle tapped. Tap, tap, tap. Jess sat in her room after the three men fell asleep, and she worked the dress across her lap, and her fingers traced the stitching, and the candle burned down, and the sound carried through the thin log walls into the main room, where the men lay in their separate darknesses. Each man heard the sound. Each man interpreted it differently. Rufus heard it and thought of his mother. She sews because she misses home. My mother used to sew at night when she missed my father. He turned over in his bed, pulled the blanket higher, and fell back asleep with the sound of the needle woven into his dreams like a lullaby. Canton heard it and said nothing to anyone. But the next morning there was another improvement to Jess's room. A new latch on the wardrobe door installed silently in the dark while she slept. He had heard the cold. He had fixed the source. That was his language, and he spoke it fluently. Shep heard it, and his ring spun faster. She sewed every night, but she never showed anyone what she had made. No finished garment, no completed piece, just the sound of the needle night after night tapping against something that none of them could see. What was she making? What was she doing in there? Then came the night that changed everything for Shepherd Farrow. He woke at 2 in the morning. The cabin was dark except for the thin line of candlelight that leaked under Jess's door, and the needle was tapping. But the rhythm was wrong. Shep was a mechanic. He understood patterns the way Canton understood grain, and Jess understood thread. His mind cataloged rhythms the way other minds catalog faces. And the rhythm he was hearing was not the rhythm of sewing. Sewing was regular. Tap, 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 steady, continuous, the needle entering fabric at even intervals. What he was hearing now was different. Tap, tap, pause, tap, pause, tap, 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 pause. That was not the rhythm of someone making something. That was the rhythm of someone reading something. Shep slid out of the hammock. His bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor. He moved to Jess's door and pressed his eye to the narrow gap between the door and the frame, a gap where the wood had shrunk as it dried, leaving a sliver of space barely wider than a finger. Candlelight. Jess on the floor, the dress spread across her lap, lining side up, and her hand was not holding a needle. Her fingers were moving across the surface of the linen, tracing the old stitches, following lines and curves and clusters of knots, left to right, top to bottom. Her lips were moving, shaping words he could not hear. She was not sewing, she was reading. Shep pulled back from the door. His back hit the hallway wall. His heart hammered against his ribs. On his left hand, the copper ring spun. Fast. Faster. He did not know what she was reading. He did not know what the stitches meant. But he knew with the certainty of a man who had spent his life recognizing the difference between what things appeared to be and what they actually were, that the dress was not just a dress. The next morning, Shepherd Farrow sat in his workshop and did not work. A pickaxe lay across the anvil in front of him, waiting to be sharpened, but his hands were still and his mind was racing. He assembled the pieces, a map on a wedding dress, sewn into the lining, hidden in plain sight, a young woman from St. Louis, the daughter of a cartographer and geological surveyor. A woman who had chosen this specific ranch on this specific mountain in this specific region of Colorado Territory. A region where 20 years ago there had been rumors, whispers among the old miners about a massive silver strike that Consolidated Mining had been close to locating before their best surveyor suddenly quit and disappeared. Prosper Alder, who had surveyed these mountains, who had found something, who had walked away from it and never told anyone where it was, until now, because now his daughter was here, with a map sewn into her mother's wedding dress, sitting in a cabin half a day's walk from whatever Prosper Alder had found and hidden and protected with his silence for 20 years. Every piece fit, every connection held. The pattern was as clear as any mechanism Shep had ever taken apart and put back together. He looked down at his left hand, the copper ring, thin, cheap, worn smooth by 8 years of turning. He had bought it with half a day's wages at the Sutter Creek mine in California in the summer of 1866, when he still believed that if he dug deep enough, he would strike gold and everything would be all right. Nell had worn the ring for 2 years. Then she got sick. Typhoid fever, the camp doctor said. Treatable, the camp doctor said. With quinine and clean water and rest. But quinine cost money, and clean water did not exist in a mining camp. And rest was something you earned after you struck it rich, not before. Shep had gone to the doctor with everything he had. The ring, a handful of coins, a pocket watch with a cracked face. The doctor had looked at the pile on his desk and then looked at Shep and said the words that had been burning inside Shepherd Pharaoh's skull every day for 8 years. Friend, this is not enough. Nell died on a Tuesday afternoon while Shep held her hand and the ring turned it on his finger, and the California sun poured through the tent flap like a mockery of warmth. If I had money, Nell would not have died. That was the equation. Simple. Absolute. Carved into the center of his brain like an epitaph. Poverty equals death. And poverty was all he had. Until now. Because now maybe wealth was hidden inside a wedding dress in the room of the bride who slept 20 feet from where he sharpened his tools and turned his ring and tried every day to believe that the past was behind him. The ring spun, fast, faster, faster still. That same week on a late afternoon when the light was going gold and the shadows of the pines stretched long across the meadow, Jess went to the creek to fill the water bucket. She crouched by the water, dipped the bucket, let the cold run over her wrists, and then as she straightened her eyes caught movement in the valley below. 2 figures on horseback. At the edge of the tree line a mile down the slope where the mountain trail met the open grassland. They were not moving. They were sitting on their horses, still as statues, and they were looking up. Jess's hand tightened on the bucket handle until the tin edge cut into her palm. The figures were too far away to identify. 2 men on dark horses silhouetted against the golden grass of the valley floor. They might have been travelers. They might have been hunters. They might have been anyone, but Jess knew. With the instinct of a woman who had been hunted for 4 months, who had learned to read the shape of danger the way her father had taught her to read the shape of rock, she knew that those men were not passing through. She picked up the bucket, walked back to the cabin, said nothing to anyone. But that night the needle did not stop until nearly dawn. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm of a woman who was counting, not flowers, not days, not stitches, but the distance between herself and something that was getting closer. Outside the cabin, the mountain stood in darkness. The snow line had crept down another 100 feet. The wind tasted of ice. And somewhere below in the valley or on the road or in a room at the saloon in Elk Creek, 2 men she had never met were asking questions about a young woman with fair hair who had arrived 2 months ago carrying a small valise and a secret worth more than all the silver in Colorado territory. Jess sat in her room, the dress in her lap, the needle in her hand, the thimble turning on her finger. She was running out of time, and the mountain was closing in. The fence on the west side of the property had collapsed under last winter's snow. 2 whole sections brought down by the weight of ice and wind, the posts snapped at the base, the crossbeams scattered across the frozen ground like the ribs of a broken ship. Canton had been meaning to rebuild it for months. But rebuilding a fence was a 3-person job, and 3 people on this ranch were already stretched thin by the daily work of keeping cattle alive and wood stacked and food stored before the mountain locked itself shut for winter. Now there were 4. On a cold, bright morning in the 3rd week of October, all 4 of them went to the west fence line and worked. Canton measured and cut. He sawed the new posts from logs he had felled the week before, sizing each one by eye, with an accuracy that came from 8 years of cutting wood until the grain spoke to him like a language. His hands moved with the steady, deliberate force of a man who believed that the only things worth trusting in this world were the things he had built with his own body. Rufus dug the post holes. He drove the shovel into the rocky mountain soil with both feet on the blade, talking the entire time. Esther did not like the new fence, he reported. She had come to the edge of the old fence line that morning and stared at the fresh posts with the deep bovine suspicion of a creature who did not appreciate change. Maud, on the other hand, did not care. Maud never cared about anything. Maud was the most philosophically indifferent cow in Colorado territory. Shep repaired the gate hinges. His long fingers bent the iron straps with pliers and a small forge hammer shaping metal, the way other men shaped words with precision and a kind of effortless grace that made hard work look like art. The hinges he produced were better than the originals, smoother, stronger. The gate would swing without a sound. and Jess tied the rope bindings. She wrapped each junction where post met crossbeam with cord, knotting it tight using a bowling hitch that cinched under pressure and would not slip. Canton noticed the knots. He stopped cutting and walked over to inspect one, turning the rope joint in his calloused hands. "Where did you learn to tie like that?" "My father taught me. A bowline knot. He used it for geological survey lines." From the gate without turning around, Shep said, "Your father taught you a lot of interesting things." A brief silence. Jess looked at Shep's back. She recognized the tone. It was not casual. It was not accidental. It was the tone of a man who was collecting information the way his fingers collected grease, unconsciously, constantly, by the nature of what he did. But Shep had already returned to his hinge, and the moment passed. By late afternoon, the fence was finished. 4 people stood looking at it. The new wood was lighter than the old pale pine against weathered gray, and the line was straight, and the gate swung smooth, and the rope bindings held firm at every junction. Canton stepped back, looked at the fence, checked the alignment. Then he nodded, once. The single nod he gave to every completed thing, his private acknowledgement. Rufus grinned. "Looks good, doesn't it?" 4 people work 3 times faster. Shep half smiled. "At least something on this ranch looks decent." Jess looked down at the ground where the late sun threw their shadows across the dirt. 4 long shapes angled by the low light, connected by the line of the fence they had just built, like a family standing together, like something that belonged. She did not know yet how soon that image would shatter, but she would remember it. On the night that Shep left, she would close her eyes and see those 4 shadows on the ground joined by rope and wood in a single afternoon of shared labor, and it would hurt worse than losing the dress. That same week, Canton walked into Jess's room carrying 3 pine boards, a hammer, and a pocket full of nails. She was sitting on the bed mending a shirt. She looked up. "What are you doing? Building a shelf. You need a place to put your things." He paused. His eyes moved to the bare corner of the room near the window. "This is your home, not a boarding house." 20 minutes of silence followed. The only sound was the hammer. Canton measured each board by holding it against the wall, marking the length with his thumbnail, and cutting with a handsaw so precise that the edges came out smooth enough to run a palm across without catching a splinter. 3 shelves, pine, corner mount, near the window where the light came in strongest. Jess watched his hands, rough, scarred, the scar on his right forearm catching the light each time he raised the hammer. His fingers smelled of pine resin and iron. He worked the way he spoke, without waste, without performance. Every stroke aimed at a result. The shelf was done. Canton stepped back, examined it, checked that the surface was level by placing a nail on the top shelf and watching it. The nail did not roll. He nodded once. "Did you build this for me?" Jess asked. Canton was already picking up his tools. He did not look at her. "I built it for the room. The room needs a shelf." Jess smiled. It was the first real smile she had offered since arriving at the ranch. Small, almost hidden, but warm in a way that changed the geometry of her face. Softened. The set of her jaw made her look for a moment like a young woman who had forgotten briefly that she was carrying a weight too heavy for her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, "for the shelf and for the room." Canton nodded. He walked to the door, and in the doorway he stopped. He turned back. He looked at the shelf, then he looked at her, then he nodded again. But this second nod was different from the first. The first had been for the shelf. The second was for something else, something he could not build with pine and nails, something that had appeared in this room without him planning it, like a wildflower growing through a crack in a foundation, unplanned and impossible to ignore. Jess saw the second nod. She understood it, and something in her chest shifted. A warmth, small but unmistakable, like late afternoon sunlight finding its way through the window that Canton had fixed for her in the dark. While the 4 people on the mountain were building fences and shelves in the slow, careful architecture of trust, Gideon Polk was building something of his own in the town below. He had arrived in Elk Creek quietly, the way he arrived everywhere. 2 men on ordinary horses wearing ordinary clothes. Polk in his worn brown hat and old vest, looking like a small-town attorney who had seen better decades. Bryce beside him, large and silent, the kind of man whose presence communicated everything his mouth never did. Polk did not rush. He never rushed. He sat in the saloon for 2 days buying drinks he barely touched, listening to conversations he pretended not to hear, asking questions so gently that the people answering them did not realize they were being interrogated until the information was already given. He asked the postmaster about mail deliveries to the ranches up the mountain. He asked the storekeeper about recent customers. He asked the bartender about newcomers. The storekeeper was the one who finally said it plainly. "Why are you asking about that girl?" Polk smiled, the smile of a man who had practiced warmth so often that it no longer looked practiced. "Her family is worried. She left suddenly. No word, no letter. Her uncle asked me to look into it. Just want to make sure she's safe. She went up to the Bridger Ranch 2 months ago." Polk nodded, filed the information. But he did not ride up the mountain. Not yet. Instead, he left a message. He told the storekeeper casually, as if it were an afterthought, "If anyone from the Bridger place comes down for supplies, would you mind mentioning that a family representative stopped by just so she knows someone is looking for her?" It was brilliant. It was also vicious. Because Polk understood something that most men in his profession did not. Physical threats were expensive and unreliable. Information was cheap and devastating. By planting a single sentence in a single shopkeeper's mouth, he had turned the entire town of Elk Creek into an extension of his surveillance. He did not need to watch the ranch. He needed the ranch to know it was being watched. And it worked. The next time Jess came down to Elk Creek with Rufus, the storekeeper mentioned it, casually, while wrapping a bolt of cloth. "A polite fellow was asking about you last week. Said he was from your family." Jess's face went white. Her fingers closed around the thimble on her right hand and squeezed until the silver edge pressed a dent into her skin. She did not ask what the man looked like. She did not need to. She knew who had sent him. She knew what he wanted. And she knew that the distance between herself and the life she had fled had just collapsed from 1,000 miles to a single mountain trail. On the wagon ride back, she was silent. Rufus glanced at her several times, but did not speak. He understood silence. He had grown up with a brother who treated it as a primary language. That night, the needle in Jess's room did not stop until 3 in the morning. The morning after Jess learned that Polk was in Elk Creek, Shepard Farrow entered her room for 30 seconds while she was at the creek. He crossed the floor in 4 strides, opened the wardrobe, found the dress, turned it inside out with hands that knew how to handle delicate mechanisms without leaving marks. The lining spread open before him. And now, with the knowledge he had assembled over the past weeks, with the pattern he had recognized through the crack in her door, he could read what he was looking at. Chain stitches curving in smooth arcs, not decorative, contour lines. The same kind of curved lines he had seen on survey maps in California showing the shape of the land by connecting points of equal elevation. Cross stitches clustered in dense patches, not floral patterns, forest markers, the same dense hatching that cartographers use to indicate heavy tree cover, and a single cluster of French knots, tiny and precise, sitting alone in the lower right quadrant of the linen panel. Not a seed pearl design, not a decorative accent, an X. "Map," Shep whispered. He replaced the dress, closed the wardrobe, left the room. His hands were shaking. On his left hand, the copper ring spun so fast it blurred. He followed her walking route the next day. Shep had spent 8 years learning this mountain. He knew every trail, every stream, crossing every rock formation within a day's walk of the ranch. And he knew which direction Jess always walked. West, always west. Toward the interior of the range, where the granite grew thicker and the timber thinned and the land rose into formations that had never been surveyed by anyone except the man who had embroidered their contours into a wedding dress. He found the stream. He found the Arrowhead Rock. He found the oak grove with its ancient trees and their canopy of gold October leaves. And behind the oaks, hidden by brush and shadow, he found the crack in the rock face. He lit the oil lamp he had brought. He squeezed through the fissure. He walked 200 steps into darkness that smelled of cold iron and wet stone. Then the lamplight hit the wall. The silver ran through the rock in veins as wide as a man's palm. Not ore that would need to be crushed and smelted and refined. Native silver, nearly pure, gleaming in the lamplight like a frozen river embedded in the granite. It ran horizontally along the walls and vertically through the ceiling, and it went back deeper than the lamplight could reach into the belly of the mountain. Shep stood motionless. His hands trembled. The copper ring on his finger felt hot, as if the metal itself could sense the proximity of its vastly more valuable cousin. The equation that had been burning inside his skull for 8 years completed itself. If I had money, Nell would not have died. Here is more money than I have ever imagined. Here is enough to buy the town. Here is enough to ensure that no one I love ever dies because I could not afford to save them. He walked out of the mine. He sat on a rock outside the fissure. He looked at the mountains. And for the first time in 8 years, Shepherd Pharaoh wept. Not from grief, not from joy, but from the terrible knowledge that he had just found something that would change everything doing. And change he had learned in California and in a typhoid tent and in every year since did not always mean better. The creek water had started to freeze at the edges. Rufus knelt by the stream that morning to wash his face and pull back with a shudder. Ice along the banks already. 3 weeks. Maybe less. Jess stood on the porch and looked up at the peaks. The snow line had dropped again. She could measure it against landmarks she had memorized. Last week the snow had sat above the granite shelf on the north face. This week it had crept below it. The mountain was closing itself inch by inch, day by day, pulling a white curtain down from the top like a shopkeeper closing for the season. 3 weeks until the trail to Elk Creek became impassable. 3 weeks until the 4 people on this mountain would be locked in together with whatever secrets and betrayals and choices they had made. The clock was running, and it was not waiting for anyone to be ready. 4 horses appeared on the trail on a cold afternoon in the last week of October. Gideon Polk rode in front, brown hat, old vest, scuffed boots. Behind him rode Bryce, silent and armed, and behind Bryce 2 more men, Brannigan and Deeks, hired muscle. They spread across the yard in a loose line, 4 horses, 4 men, 4 sets of eyes taking in the cabin, the fence, the cattle, shed, the forge, and the 3 people who stood between them and the woman they had come for. Polk dismounted with the careful efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times and no longer needed to think about it. Good afternoon. My name is Gideon Polk. I represent the Alder family of St. Louis. I am here to locate the niece of Aldous Alder, a young woman named Jessamine Alder. Her family is very concerned. Inside the kitchen, Jess heard every word through the open window. The blood drained from her face. Her hands gripped this curtain she had been hanging, the curtain she had hemmed and bordered with neat linen, stitching her first week on the ranch, and she held on as if the fabric were the only thing keeping her upright. Canton set his axe down against the porch railing. He stepped forward. His shoulders filled the doorframe. His gray-blue eyes found Polk and held him the way a carpenter holds a board steady and level, looking for where it might break. There is nobody named Alder here. Polk smiled. Patient, polite, dangerous. She may be using a different name. A young woman, fair-haired, arrived approximately 2 months ago, carrying a small valise and possibly an old wedding dress. The silence that followed was heavy enough to have weight. Rufus looked at Canton. Shep, standing in the doorway of his workshop, looked at the ground. Canton's voice did not waver. She is the promised bride of this family. Her people have no claim here. Polk reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Red seal, signature, official stamp. I have a court order requiring the return of Jessamine Alder to St. Louis under the authority of her legal guardian. Canton took the paper. He looked at it. He could not read the legal language, could not parse the Latin phrases and jurisdictional references. But he looked at the seal and the signature, and then he looked at Jess standing in the kitchen doorway with wide eyes and white knuckles. Give us a week. Polk shook his head. 3 days, sir. The Alder family is quite anxious. He tipped his hat, mounted his horse. Bryce and the 2 hired men followed. 4 horses turned on the trail and rode back down the mountain, leaving dust hanging in the cold October air like a stain. 3 days. That night, the 4 of them sat around the kitchen table. The fire burned. The coffee was black and untouched. No one ate. Jess spoke carefully, each word placed like a stone on a path. My real name is Jessamine Alder. My father was Prosper Alder. He died 4 months ago. My uncles Aldous and Vernon want what he left behind. He did not leave money. He left only my mother's wedding dress. My uncles believe my father hid something valuable. Canton looked directly at her. In the dress, Jess looked down at her hands. The thimble turned on her finger. My father was a cartographer. He drew up maps. She said nothing more. She did not say silver mine. She did not say fortune. She did not say that the answer to every question about her past was sewn into the lining of a garment hanging in her wardrobe 20 feet away. She said my father drew maps and let each man carry that sentence wherever his own mind would take it. Rufus leaned forward. You ran because your uncle wants the dress. Jess nodded. Shep sat motionless. The ring turned, fast. His eyes were fixed on the table, but behind them his mind was running calculations. Map. On a dress. Map of what leading where Canton stood. Pushed back his chair. The legs scraped against the wooden floor with a sound like a door closing. Polk comes back in 3 days. We need a plan. He looked at Jess. Do you want to stay? This is the only place I have. Canton held her gaze. This was not the assessing look he had given her on her first day. This was a decision. Made. Settled. Final. Then you stay. And your old family will have to come through me first. He said it the way he said everything. Without decoration, without emphasis, the way a man states a measurement or reads a level. A fact. Not a promise, but something harder. A load-bearing truth. And Jess understood in that moment that Canton Bridger had chosen her, before he knew what the map led to. He was not protecting the treasure. He was protecting her. That night after Jess had gone to her room, the 3 men sat around the dying fire. Shep spoke first. His voice was low and controlled, but there was a tremor underneath it, like a crack in a bell that only becomes audible when you strike it hard enough. I found it, in the mountainside, half a day's walk west. A silver mine, bigger than anything I saw in California, bigger than anything I can describe. Canton stared into the fire. For a long time, the coals shifted, a log settled, sparks rose and died. Then he said, that belongs to her father's map. Her father is dead, Canton, and her family is coming for it. If we file a claim first, if we register the discovery with the territorial office before Polk comes back, it is ours. Legally. We found it. We live on this land. No. Listen to me. We are poor. We live in a log cabin. We eat stew every night. Last winter, we nearly lost 5 head of cattle because we could not afford enough feed. This mine could change everything. It is not ours. Rufus had been sitting quietly. His face was not angry. It was sweating. The sadness of a man who loves someone and is watching that person walk toward a cliff. Shep, Rufus said softly, she came here because she was running from people who wanted the mine. If we want it too, how are we different from her family? The question was simple. Honest. It carried no accusation. It was just a question. But it cut deeper than anything Canton's rigid morality could have delivered because it did not argue about right and wrong. It asked about identity. It asked Shep to look in a mirror. Shep looked at Rufus. He looked at the fire. The ring spun on his finger. Then he stood and walked out into the darkness without a word. 3 reactions to the same temptation. Canton refused with the hardness of stone. Rufus questioned with the gentleness of a man who still believed in goodness. And Shep was silent with the terrible gravity of a man being pulled in a direction he knew was wrong, but could not resist. Jess already knew. She had seen the way Shep looked at the dress, the way his eyes sharpened each time she mentioned her father. The way his ring spun faster day by day, like a gauge measuring pressure building toward a rupture. She made her decision. For 2 nights she sat in her room and sewed. Not reading the map this time. Creating one. On a fresh piece of linen cut from a spare cloth she had brought from St. Louis, she embroidered a duplicate of the map inside the dress. The same style, the same stitches, the same language of chain and satin and French knots that her mother had invented and taught her, but wrong. The false map shifted the critical point. The cluster of French knots, the X that marked the mine entrance, was moved north. Instead of pointing toward the oak grove and the rock fissure on the western slope, the false map directed its reader toward a region of bare granite on the northern face. Solid rock, no caves, no fissures, no silver. A person following the false map would spend 2 weeks climbing barren stone and find nothing. Canton passed her door late that night, heard the needle, saw through the crack where the wood had shrunk the glow of her candle, and her bent head and the rapid movement of her hands. He knocked softly. "What are you doing?" Her voice came through the door without hesitation. "Insurance." Canton did not ask for details. He stood in the hallway and listened to the rhythm of her needle, and he understood, without needing explanation, that she was not just sewing. She was building, the same way he built, with the same precision and the same purpose, using different materials but the same intent: defense, preparation, the construction of a barrier between what she protected and what threatened it. He nodded in the dark hallway where no one could see him. Then he went back to bed. On the porch the following evening, Canton spoke more than he had spoken to anyone in years. The half-moon hung over the ridge. Coffee steamed in their cups. The cold was sharp enough now that their breath made small clouds. "I went to California in 1868, Canton said, "with Rufus and Shep. We dug for gold at Sutter Creek. Lost everything. Money, faith, the skin off our backs twice. Robbed on the road coming out of the mountains. Robbed again at a way station in Nevada." He paused, looked down at his hands. The cuts and calluses and scars, each one a sentence in the story of 8 years of building. "I came up here because I wanted to build something that no one could take. 8 years, cabin, shed, fence, workshop. Every nail I drove, I thought, this is mine. No one takes this." Another pause, longer. "But a cabin needs more than nails and wood." Rufus knew that. That is why he placed the advertisement. "I was angry when I found out." He turned and looked at Jess. The moonlight caught one side of her face, blue and silver, and her eyes held his, and in them he saw something he had not expected. Not gratitude, not dependence. Understanding. She understood the need to build. She understood the fear of loss. She understood the contradiction of a man who had spent 8 years constructing a life and only now was discovering that the most important part of it could not be constructed at all. It had to be accepted, received, trusted. "Now I am not angry anymore," he said. "Neither am I," she said. The silence that followed was the longest and the most comfortable they had shared. Jess's shoulders, which had been held rigid and high since the day she left St. Louis, lowered. Just slightly. Just enough that a person watching closely would have seen it. The physical release of a weight that had been carried too long. 2 days before Shep took the dress, he did the kindest thing he had done since arriving on the mountain. Jess was sitting on the porch mending a shirt when Shep came out of his workshop carrying a small tin box. He sat beside her on the bench. Opened the box. Inside lay a set of sewing needles. 6 of them, different sizes, arranged in a row on a strip of leather. They were made of steel, not the soft iron of the needles Jess had been using since St. Louis. The tips were sharp enough to catch light. The shafts were straight and polished and perfectly balanced. Shep had forged them himself. "I noticed your needles were bending," he said. "Old ones, soft metal. I made these from tool steel. Harder, sharper. They won't curve on you." Jess picked up one of the needles and held it between her thumb and forefinger. It was lighter than her old needles, better balanced. The tip caught a point of sunlight and held it like a tiny star. She pushed the needle through the shirt fabric. It went through like a whisper, smooth and effortless, and she pulled the thread after it in a stitch so clean it was nearly invisible. "These are the finest needles I have ever used," she said, and her voice, for the first time in Shep's presence, held no caution, only genuine warmth. "Thank you, Shep." Shep smiled, and this smile was not the charming half-smile he wore like armor. This smile reached his eyes. This smile was real. "Mel liked to sew too," he said. "She made shirts for me. Terrible shirts. The seams were crooked and the collars never sat right, but I wore every one of them until they fell apart." He was quiet. The ring turned slowly. "She would have liked you." Jess looked at him and saw for the first time not the clever, charming man with the bitter edge. She saw a man who was sad. Sad because his wife had died. Sad because he was poor. Sad because he was lonely and had been lonely for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to not be. "Nell was a good person, wasn't she?" "Nell is the reason I am still here," Shep said. The ring turned, slowly, peacefully, the way it turned when the past felt like a companion rather than a haunting. This was the last good thing Shepherd Pharaoh did before he betrayed them all. And it mattered that it was good, because if he had been cold, if he had been calculating, if he had shown his intentions through cruelty or distance, then what came next would have been merely criminal. Instead, it was tragic, because the man who forged the needles and the man who stole the dress were the same man, and neither one was a lie. On the third night after Shep discovered the mine, Jess sat in her room and held the last piece of her mother's handiwork in her hands. The linen panel lay across her lap. She had already detached it from the dress, carefully stitch by stitch, cutting each thread with a small blade so as not to tear the fabric. The original map, the real one, embroidered by Emmeline Alder nearly 20 years ago in a small house in St. Louis, while her husband sat at his desk and read coordinates aloud, and their infant daughter slept in a cradle by the window. Jess's fingers traced the chain stitches one last time. She could feel where her mother's hand had moved quickly, the curves slightly uneven, and where her mother had taken care of the lines running straight and true with the precision of a woman who understood that she was transcribing something important, something that might outlast her. The smell of the linen was faint, lavender. Her mother had kept dried lavender in the wardrobe where the dress hung. The scent had soaked into the fibers over years and never fully left. Jess stood up. She walked to the kitchen. She opened the stove door. Inside, the coals glowed red, pulsing with the slow breath of a fire that had been banked for the night. She held the linen panel over the opening. The heat rose against her wrist. She stopped. Her hand was shaking. Tears ran down her face, silent dropping onto the fabric. She pulled the linen back, pressed it against her chest, breathed in the lavender, breathed in her mother. This was the last thing Emmeline had made with her own hands. Every stitch was a touch, every thread was a connection. If she burned it, she would lose the last physical link to the woman who had taught her to hold a needle, who had shown her that thread could carry meaning, the way words carry thought, who had died when Jess was 10 years old and left behind a dress and a thimble, and a secret that had been devouring the family ever since. But if she kept it, the secret would continue to kill. It had killed her father, not directly. But the mine was the reason Aldous had pursued Prosper relentlessly, the reason the old man had spent his last years looking over his shoulder, the reason he had died exhausted and afraid in a room that smelled of camphor and regret. It had nearly killed her. 4 months of running, fake names, borrowed courage, sleepless nights in boarding houses where every footstep in the hallway might be Aldous' man. And it was killing Shep. She could see it happening, the ring spinning faster each day, the eyes growing sharper, the charm curdling into calculation. The mine was transforming a good man into a thief, and it was doing it with the same patient inevitability that the mountain used to freeze the creek. Degree by degree, day by day, Horace Tull's voice echoed in her memory, the old man on the porch. The clouded eyes and the steady back and the words that Prosper Alder had spoken 20 years ago, and that now in this kitchen, at this moment, became the instruction that his daughter needed. If you keep it, it will kill more people than it feeds. Jess looked at the linen one final time. Her fingertip touched the cluster of French knots. The X, the last mark of her father's greatest discovery and her mother's finest work. Then she placed the fabric on the coals. The linen caught, curled. The thread began to burn. Chain stitches contracted and blackened. Satin stitches turned to thin lines of ash. The French knots, the tiny perfect knots that marked the location of more silver than most men would see in a lifetime, glowed white for an instant, and then went dark, and then were gone. Jess stood at the stove and watched the map burn. Her mother's stitching, her father's secret, 20 years of silence. All of it turning to ash in a kitchen stove on a mountain in Colorado, while the wind blew outside and the coals shifted and the smoke rose through the chimney into the October night. When it was done, she took the false map, the one she had embroidered over 2 sleepless nights, and she sewed it into the lining of the dress. Same stitches, same patterns, same apparent geography, but pointing the wrong direction. She hung the dress back in the wardrobe. She closed the door. She went to bed, and for the first time in months, she slept without dreaming. The frost that came the next morning was not dew frozen on the grass. It was ice, white and crystalline and thick enough to crunch under boots. Rufus stood on the porch and looked at it the way a sailor looks at storm clouds. Hard frost, 2 weeks, maybe sooner. On the peaks, the snow had reached the halfway point of the visible slope. From the cabin porch, you could see it clearly, a white line drawn across the mountain like a border. Everything above it was winter. Everything below it was borrowed time. On the second night of Polk's three-day deadline, Shepard Farrow lay in his hammock and stared at the ceiling. The cabin was dark, Canton on his bed near the door, breathing the deep, steady breath of a man who had decided what he would do and was resting before he did it. Rufus on his bed by the window, a fresh flower on the table beside him. Number 17, the 17th flower he had given Jess, and the 17th she had pressed between the pages of Pilgrim's Progress. The ring on Shep's finger turned. Fast, faster. The copper was warm from his body heat, and the turning, and it felt, he thought, like a pulse separate from his own. Nell's pulse, still beating on his hand 8 years after her heart had stopped. Then the turning stopped. Shep sat up. He looked at his left hand in the darkness. The ring, thin, cheap, worn smooth. He had slid it onto Nell's finger in a tent in California while a preacher with gold dust in his beard said the words. He had slid it off her finger in a different tent 3 years later, while her body cooled and the camp doctor packed his bag and the sunlight poured in through the canvas like a joke. He took the ring between the thumb and forefinger of his right hand. He pulled it slowly off his finger. He held it for a moment, feeling its absence on his skin, the exposed groove where it had sat for 8 years. Then he placed it on the kitchen table, next to Canton's coffee cup, next to Rufus's flower vase. As if to keep Nell from seeing what he was about to do, he went to Jess's room. The door opened without sound. The wardrobe opened without resistance. The dress was where it always was, white cotton and old lace folded in the shadow at the back of the shelf. He took it, rolled it tight, put it in a leather satchel, crossed the kitchen, went out the back door, saddled his horse in the dark, and rode north. In her bed, Jess lay with her eyes open. She heard everything. The hammock creak as he rose, the soft footsteps across the floor, the pause at the kitchen table, the wardrobe door, the rustle of fabric, the back door, the creak of saddle leather, the hooves on dirt growing fainter, growing distant, disappearing into the mountain dark. She did not move. Tears ran from the corners of her eyes into the pillow. Not because she had lost the map. The map inside the dress was false. Shep would follow it to bare rock and empty sky. She cried because she had been right. She had known he would take it. She had prepared for it. She had planned for this exact moment with the careful precision that her father had taught her and her mother's needlework had refined. But being right did not mean it did not hurt. The dress was gone. Her mother's dress. White cotton that Emmeline had worn on her wedding day in a small church in St. Louis. Lace that Emmeline had tatted with her own hands. The last physical object on earth that Jess could hold and say, "My mother touched this." Gone. On the back of a horse ridden by a man who had forged her the new needles 2 days ago and told her that his dead wife would have liked her. Jess held her pillow, turned the thimble. The only thing she had left of her mother now was a circle of silver on her finger and the skills that Emmeline had placed in her hands before the consumption took everything else. She did not fall back asleep. Canton rose at dawn the way he always did. He went to the kitchen. He reached for his coffee cup, and he saw the ring, copper, thin, smooth, sitting on the table in a circle of weak morning light, small and simple and devastating. Nell's ring, the ring that had not left Shep's finger for 8 years. Canton picked it up. He did not need to check the workshop. He did not need to look at the empty hammock or the missing horse. The ring told him everything. Shep had taken it off. Shep had left. And Shep had left the ring behind because there are things a man does not want his dead wife to witness. Rufus came out of his room yawning. He saw Canton's face and stopped. What happened? Canton held out the ring. Rufus took it, turned it in his fingers, and his expression changed. Sleep fell away. Understanding arrived. And behind the understanding, pain. The specific pain of a man who has loved someone and trusted someone and just learned that the trust was not enough. They went to Jess's room. The wardrobe stood open, empty. Jess sat on her bed. Her eyes were red, but her face was calm. The calm of a woman who had seen this coming and had prepared for it and was now living inside the moment she had feared and planned from in equal measure. Rufus looked at the table beside her bed. The book was still there. Pilgrim's Progress. He opened it. 17 pressed flowers, each one a day, each one a gift. each one still holding its color and its shape between the pages as if the book had agreed to keep them safe even when everything else was falling apart. He closed the book. He walked outside. He found a blue columbine growing near the creek, one of the last of the season, small and bright against the frosted grass. He picked it, walked back, placed it on the floor outside Jess's door. Flower number 18. He did not say a word. He did not need to. The flower said it. You are still here. I am still here. We continue. Canton Bridger hit the porch column with his fist. The wood cracked. A split ran through the pine, from the point of impact to a knot halfway up the post, and a piece of bark the size of a playing card fell to the ground. Blood appeared on his knuckles, immediately welling up from the torn skin in dark red lines that ran between his fingers and dripped onto the floorboards. He did not feel it. Or if he felt it, the pain was nothing compared to what was happening inside his chest, which was a kind of burning that had no physical source and no remedy that a man who solved problems with his hands could apply. I trusted him. His voice was low and controlled, but the control was the most frightening thing about it, because beneath it was a fury that could have leveled the cabin he had spent 8 years building. 8 years. I built with him. This cabin, I measured the walls and he set the hinges. This fence, I dug the post holes and he cast the iron braces. Last week we built the winter fence together. 4 people, and he stole from her in the middle of the night like a common thief. Rufus stood in the doorway. His face was not angry, it was sad. The deep, uncomplicated sadness of a man who loved someone and had just watched that person choose the wrong path. Shep is not a thief, Rufus said quietly. Shep is in pain. Pain is not a reason to steal. No, Rufus said. Rufus. But pain is a reason to go wrong, and wrong can be fixed. Canton looked at his brother, the younger one, the one who planted flowers because their mother had said a house without flowers was just 4 walls. The one who gave names to cattle and sang badly in the morning and had never in 28 years of living stopped believing that people were capable of being better than their worst moments. And for the first time, Canton thought something he had never thought before. That maybe Rufus was not naive. Maybe Rufus was stronger than he was. Because choosing to trust after being betrayed was harder, much harder, than choosing to trust no one at all. Jess called the 2 brothers into the kitchen. The fire was burning. The light threw their shadows against the log walls. Her voice was calm and tired, and steady, the voice of a woman who had been carrying a secret for months and was now finally setting it down. Shep took a dress with a false map. I replaced it a week ago. Canton's eyes widened. You knew he would take it. I saw the way he looked at the dress, the way my father described how miners look at gold, hungry and afraid at the same time. Rufus leaned forward. Where is the real map? Burned. The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of the fire became enormous. Each pop and crack of the coals filled the room like a small explosion. Canton stared at her. You burned a map to a silver mine. Jess met his gaze. In the firelight, her face looked older than 22. She looked like someone who had just set down a weight she had been carrying since before she was old enough to understand what it was. That mine killed my father, not directly, but it was the reason my uncle pursued him until he was too exhausted to fight off a winter cold. Horace Tull, the old miner in town, told me what my father said 20 years ago. If you keep it, it will kill more people than it feeds. She paused. My father was right. Look at what it did to Shep. He was a good man 2 weeks ago. The mine is turning him into something else. Canton was silent for a long time. The fire burned, the wind pushed against the cabin walls. You burned the thing that could have made you the richest person in the territory. Jess looked at him, directly, without blinking. I burned the thing that would have cost me everything I have just found. 1 beat, 2, 3. Canton nodded, once. Slow, heavy. The nod he gave not to completed shelves or finished fences, but to something larger. Something he could not build or measure or cut to size. Something that had to be recognized because it could not be constructed. He was nodding for her decision, for the kind of strength that destroys a fortune in order to keep something that has no price. The morning of the 3rd day arrived under a sky the color of iron. Low clouds pressed down on the peaks. The wind cut through clothing and found the skin beneath. The temperature had dropped overnight, and when Rufus went to the creek to fill the water bucket, he came back with frost on his eyebrows and a grim expression. Snow could come this week, earlier than usual. Canton had been up since before dawn. He checked his rifle. He counted his ammunition. He closed the cattle shed doors and brought the livestock inside. He moved through the preparations with the methodical focus of a man who had decided exactly what he was willing to fight for and was making sure he had the tools to do it. Jess stood in the kitchen, calm, still. Her hands were steady. She had been running for 4 months and hiding for 2 more, and somewhere in that time she had used up all of her fear, and what was left was something quieter and more dangerous. Resolve. The decision had been made. The map was ash. The false map was in the dress that Shep had taken north. And whatever came next, she would face it standing in the doorway of a cabin that had become, without her planning it, without her permission, a place she was willing to defend. Polk arrived at noon. 4 horses on the trail, Polk in front, his brown hat low against the wind. Bryce behind him, large and silent, and armed. Brannigan and Deeks flanking wide, spreading across the yard in a loose formation that covered the cabin door, the cattle shed, and the path to the creek. They were not pretending anymore. There were no polite smiles, no folded documents, no legal language. Just 4 men with guns and a deadline that had expired. 3 days are up, Polk said. His voice had lost its courtroom warmth. What remained was the flat, efficient tone of a man who charged by the day and was tired of delays. The girl and the dress. Now. Canton stepped onto the porch. The rifle was in his hands. He was not aiming it. He was holding it across his body the way a man holds a tool he knows how to use and is prepared to use if the moment requires it. Rufus stood beside him, his revolver in its holster, his hand resting on the grip. Canton spoke, and when he spoke, every word landed with the weight of a man who had spent the night reading a fraudulent document by candlelight, with Jess sitting beside him, explaining each line, each missing element, each error that revealed the paper for what it was. Your court order is a forgery, no federal case number, no clerk of court seal. The signature does not match the standard format for territorial jurisdiction. You are not a lawyer, Mr. Polk. You are a bounty hunter with a piece of paper that would not survive 30 seconds in front of a judge. Polk's face went flat. The small muscles around his eyes tightened. You read legalese well for a rancher. Jess stepped out from behind Canton. Her back was straight, her chin was up. Her blue eyes were clear and bright and absolutely unafraid. He did not read it, I did. My father worked with territorial courts for 20 years. Survey commissions, mineral rights claims, land seizure orders. I know what a real court document looks like. And that paper is scrap. Polk studied her, recalculated. His pale gray eyes moved across her face the way they moved across every surface, reading not the person, but the information the person contained. Then you know I do not need a real court order. I just need the dress. The dress is not here. Where is it? Ask the man who took it. He rode north. He has a head start and he will not be easy to find. Polk's jaw tightened. He looked at Canton. Steady. At Rufus. Steady. At Jess. Steadiest of all. 3 people, 2 guns, and a resolve that his professional instincts told him would not break without more force than he was willing to apply on an exposed mountain slope with witnesses. He made a decision. Quick. Practical. The decision of a man who understood cost and benefit. The way other men understood weather. Brannigan, the cattle shed. Brannigan dismounted. He walked to the shed. The cattle inside shifted and lowed. The shed door opened and closed, and then a sound that split the morning like an axe through green wood. A single gunshot. Silence. Brannigan walked out of the shed. His revolver hung at his side, a thread of smoke rising from the barrel. One head, as a reminder. Canton's face went white. The blood drained from his skin so completely that the scar on his forearm stood out like a brand. His hands closed around the rifle stock until his knuckles turned the color of bone. Maud, the cow that Rufus had named. The one that was always fussy about her feed, the one that never cared about anything, the one whose philosophical indifference Rufus had joked about 100 times over 100 suppers. Rufus stood on the porch. His eyes had gone red. his lips pressed tight. His hands shook at his sides. He did not speak. He did not trust himself to speak. Polk mounted his horse. He looked down at the three of them from the saddle, and his face held no malice, which made it worse. He was not cruel. He was professional, and professionals did not waste emotion on the mechanisms of their trade. 3 days was courtesy. Next time I will not be courteous. His eyes found Jess. North, you said. Jess nodded. The four horses turned on the trail and rode north, toward Shep, toward the false map, toward 2 weeks of climbing barren rock and finding nothing. After the sound of hooves had faded, Rufus walked into the cattle shed. He knelt beside Maud. He put his hand on the animal's neck, on the still warm hide, and he stayed there in the straw and the silence for a long time. Canton stood outside the shed. He drove his fist into the porch column again. This time the wood held. His skin did not. The knuckles of his right hand split open and blood ran down his fingers in thin red lines. Jess came to him. She did not speak. She reached into her apron pocket and took out a handkerchief. It was the one she had embroidered with a border of small flowers the week before, white thread on cotton, tiny petals and curving stems. She took Canton's hand, turned it over, wiped the blood gently with the cloth, wrapped the handkerchief around his damaged knuckles and tied it carefully, her small fingers working against his large, rough ones with the precision of a woman whose hands had been trained since childhood to handle delicate materials without causing harm. Canton watched her hands tend his hand, the hand that built houses, the hand that had just struck wood because of her, now being wrapped in a piece of cloth that she had decorated with flowers. I will rebuild the shed, he whispered. I know. But Maud. Jess finished tying the bandage. She looked up at him. Rufus will name the next calf. He is that kind of man. Canton looked at her, and something changed behind his eyes. Not the sudden blaze of romantic revelation. Something quieter. The slow, deep recognition that she understood his family better than he understood it himself. That she knew Rufus's heart and Shep's weakness and Canton's own stubborn, silent way of loving, and she knew it not because she had been told, but because she had been watching the way she watched rock formations, the way she read stitching, the way she read everything, with patience and attention and a mind that missed nothing. Jess sat on the porch step. She breathed, and for the first time since St. Louis, her shoulders dropped completely. Not the partial release she had allowed herself on the evening when Canton told her about California. This was total. The last weight she had been carrying, the threat of Polk and the men behind him, had just ridden north following a map that led to empty stone. Canton sat beside her. Rufus came out of the shed with hay on his knees and redness around his eyes. He went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee, set them down, and sat on her other side. 3 people on a porch, afternoon light slanting through clouds, the mountains in the distance, gray and white and silent. I am sorry I did not tell the truth from the beginning, Jess said. Canton lifted his coffee, drank, set it down. You told the truth when it mattered. That is enough. Rufus wrapped both hands around his cup. And you are still here. That is more than enough. 2 days later, the sound of hooves came up the trail again. Canton rose from the porch where he had been repairing a section of the cattle shed wall. His hand went to the rifle before his mind had finished processing the sound. The mountain had made him this way. 8 years of building and guarding and expecting the worst had turned his reflexes into something architectural, a system of responses as reliable as the joints in his cabin walls. A single horse, moving slowly, tired. Shepherd Farrow rode into the yard alone. The horse was dust-covered and spent. Shep's face was a map of its own, every line and hollow reading, exhaustion and shame. Not the kind of shame that hides. The kind that sits on the surface, visible in the set of the mouth, in the way the eyes will not stay in one place, darting from the cabin to the porch to the ground, as if searching for a spot where the gaze might land without encountering judgment. He dismounted, looked at Canton, who stood on the porch with his arms crossed, his jaw set, his face made of the same material as the granite peaks behind him. Shep did not explain. He did not justify. He said only what had happened. I opened the dress, read the map, rode north for a day, climbed, found nothing. Only rock. The map was false. The wind blew. A dead leaf scraped across the yard. I sat on top of that rock all Night. Cold. Did not sleep, and I thought, not about the mine, I thought about Nell. He looked down at his left hand. The ring finger was bare. The groove where the copper band had sat for 8 years was visible, a pale indentation in sun-browned skin, like the scar left by a fence post pulled from the ground. I thought about what Nell would say if she could see me, sitting on a mountaintop in the dark holding a stolen dress, with greed on my face and her ring on someone else's table, because I did not want her to watch what I was doing. His voice broke, not dramatically, quietly. The way a timber cracks under too much weight, a small sound that signals something structural giving way. I think Nell would have said, Shep, I married you because you were good, not because you were rich, and right now you are not good. He stood in the yard with his empty hands and his bare ring finger and his dust-covered coat, and he was not the charming man who had winked at Jess on her first day. He was not the clever mechanic who could bend metal like butter. He was not the bitter widower who joked about poverty to keep from screaming about it. He was just a man who had gone wrong and knew it and had come back to say so. I turned around, but before I came back here, I stopped in Elk Creek. I went to Sheriff Harmon. I told him everything. Aldous Alder hired Gideon Polk. The court order was forged. The entire operation was an illegal conspiracy to seize property through fraud and intimidation. Harmon sent a telegraph to the federal marshal's office in Denver. The Alder family will be arrested. Shep reached into his coat. He drew out a bundle of white fabric folded carefully and held it out toward the kitchen door where Jess now stood. I took this. I am bringing it back. The map inside is false. I know that now. But the dress is real, and it belongs to your mother. Jess stepped off the threshold. She crossed the yard. She took the dress from Shep's hands and pressed it against her chest and held it the way she had held it in St. Louis, when she pulled it from the wardrobe, the way she had held it on the train, the way she held it every night when she spread it across her lap in the candlelight. Tears came. Not fear, not grief. The tears of a woman who had believed she would never hold this fabric again. Her mother's dress, white cotton, handmade lace, the last physical object on earth that carried the touch of Emmeline Alder's hands, gone for 3 days and returned by the man who had taken it. Canton looked at Shep for a long time. His arms were crossed. His jaw was locked. The bandaged hand wrapped in Jess's embroidered handkerchief hung at his side with the fingers curled tight. When he spoke, each word came out the way nails come out of a hammer. One at a time, driven hard, set deep. You betrayed us. You stole from her. You left in the middle of the night. Shep nodded. He offered nothing. No excuse, no context, no appeal to the circumstances that had driven him. He stood in the judgment and accepted it. But you came back. You went to the sheriff. You brought the dress. Canton breathed. The breath was visible in the cold air, a small white cloud that formed and dissolved. I do not forgive easily. You know that about me. Shep nodded again. But I also do not destroy what I have built. 8 years, Shep. This cabin, this fence, this late life, you are in it. You have been in it since California. I am not going to tear it down because of one night. He paused. The wind filled the silence. You want to stay? Then stay. Work. Fix what you broke. Start with the cattle shed. Polk shot Maud because of you. Shep closed his eyes. Maud. The cow with the name. The cow that Rufus talked to every morning. Dead because Polk came. And Polk came because Aldous sent him, and Aldous sent him because of the mine. And the mine was the thing that Shep had chased across a mountain in the dark with a stolen dress in his hands. I will fix it, Shep said. Canton nodded, turned, went inside. Forgiveness from a man like Canton Bridger did not come wrapped in warm words or soft gestures. It came in the language of construction. You do not demolish a structure that took 8 years to build because of one failure in the foundation. You assess the damage. You reinforce the weak point. You keep building. That was how a carpenter forgave, not with absolution, but with a decision to continue. Rufus came out of the cabin carrying a small object in his closed fist. He walked to Shep, opened his hand. The copper ring sat in his palm, thin, cheap, worn smooth by 8 years of turning. It caught no light because there was no light to catch. Copper did not gleam. It was not silver or gold. It was the metal of men who could not afford anything better, and it held value only because of what it meant to the man who wore it. You left this on the table, Rufus said. Shep looked at the ring. He took it from Rufus's palm. He slid it onto his finger, and he turned it, slowly, gently. Not the rapid, anxious spinning of the weeks before, the motion of a man tormented by the past. This was different. This was the slow, even rotation of a man who was remembering, not haunting. Carrying the past, not being dragged by it. Nell's ring was back on his finger, and the turning was peaceful. Shep looked at Jess, who stood in the kitchen doorway, the dress pressed against her chest. I am sorry. I know. You knew I would take the dress. I knew you wanted to take it. I hoped you would not. But I prepared for both. Shep laughed, and this laugh was real. Not the charming laugh he used as armor, not the bitter laugh he used as a shield against the knowledge of his own poverty. A tired, relieved, ashamed laugh. The laugh of a man who has reached the bottom of his worst self and found to his surprise that the bottom is not permanent, that there is a way back up. You are smarter than all three of us put together. My mother was smart, Jess said. I only learned from her. That night, Rufus and Shep sat by the fire. Canton had gone to bed. Jess was in her room. The logs crackled. The light shifted. Two men who had known each other for 8 years sat in a silence that held more weight than any conversation they had ever had. I trusted you the most out of the three of us, Rufus said. His voice was quiet, steady, but there was something in it that had not been there before. A hairline fracture that could heal given time, but would always leave a mark. You know that, right? I know. And you left. I left. Silence. The fire popped. A log shifted and sent sparks upward. Trusting someone a second time is harder than trusting them the first time. I know, but I am going to try. Rufus looked at Shep. His gray-blue eyes, the same color as his brother's, but warmer, held no anger. They held something more difficult than anger. They held the choice to remain open when closing would have been easier. Because if I cannot trust anyone, then what am I doing up here? Shep looked at the man beside him. The man who picked wildflowers every morning and pressed them into a book and named his cows and sang badly while he worked and had never, not once in 8 years, stopped believing that people were fundamentally good. Rufus was not innocent. He was not ignorant. He knew exactly what had happened and exactly how much it had cost, but he chose to trust anyway. Not because he was foolish, because trust was the foundation of everything he had built inside himself, and without it, the structure could not stand. Thank you, Rufus. Rufus stood, stretched, headed toward his bed. At the doorway he turned. Don't thank me. Fix the cattle shed. The snow came on a Tuesday morning in early November. Jess opened the cabin door and the world had changed. A thin layer of white covered everything. The wildflower beds that Rufus had planted along the path, dead now, their brown stems standing stiff above the snow, like tiny monuments to color that had been. The fence that all four of them had built together, the new wood darker now under its white coat. The cattle shed that Canton was rebuilding one board at a time, with Shep working beside him on the hinges, and the braces, the two men not talking much, but working with the rhythm of people who had shared labor for a long time and did not need words to coordinate their hands. The trail down to Elk Creek was getting difficult. Rufus said 2 more weeks before it closed entirely. Jess stood in the doorway. She looked at the snow. She felt the cold air on her face and the warm air from the fire on her back. And for the first time since she had arrived on this mountain, she did not think about leaving before the trail closed. She thought, I am staying. Not because she was trapped, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this was where she wanted to be. This cabin, this mountain, these men who built with wood and iron and flowers and forgiveness. She was choosing. On an afternoon when the first snow had mostly melted and the sky had cleared to a pale, cold blue, Canton was working on the cattle shed, replacing the boards that Polk's men had damaged when they entered to shoot Maud, measuring cutting fitting, the familiar motions of repair. Jess brought him coffee, a tin cup steaming in the cold air. She set it on the fence post where she had left coffee for him once before, weeks ago, after he had fixed her window in the night. Canton set down his saw, took the cup, drank, looked at her. Her face was pink from the cold. Her blue eyes were bright against the pale skin. Her hair loosened from its pins by the wind fell in waves around her temples. She was not beautiful in the way that paintings were beautiful. She was beautiful in the way that a well-made joint was beautiful, or a straight fence line, or a dawn that arrived exactly when you needed it. "Will you stay through the winter?" he asked, "if you still want me to." Canton held the cup in both hands. The bandage on his high knuckles, the embroidered handkerchief she had tied there days ago, was still in place. He had not removed it. He had not replaced it with a clean cloth. He wore her flowers on his broken skin as if they were a part of him now. "I want you to," he said. And then after a pause that held the weight of 8 years of solitude and the slow, careful dismantling of every wall he had built around himself, and not because the room needs someone in it, Jess smiled, fully, openly, the kind of smile she had not worn since before her father died, since before the secret and the running and the fear. "I know," she said. Canton set the cup down on the fence post. He held out his hand, rough, scarred, calloused, smelling of pine resin and iron and the sawdust of a man who had spent his life turning raw material into shelter. Jess placed her hand in his, small, soft, the fingertips bearing the tiny calluses that only a lifetime of needlework could produce. Two hands, different as wood and thread, holding each other. They did not kiss. They did not need to. The touch was enough. Two people who spoke in actions rather than words had found in the joining of their hands a vocabulary that said everything that mattered. Canton nodded. Once. For her. Jess opened Pilgrim's Progress on the kitchen table, 17 flowers pressed between the pages. Plus the 18th, the blue columbine that Rufus had left outside her door on the morning after Shep took the dress. Each one flattened and dried, each one still holding its color. Each one a single day recorded in petals and stem, and the quiet language of a man who believed that every house needed flowers to be a home. She walked outside. The snow had melted in patches, and in one of those patches in the brown remains of Rufus's wildflower bed, something had survived. A wild aster, small, pale purple, its stem thin and its petals slightly curled from the cold, but its center still golden and its roots still holding the frozen ground. It had survived the first frost and the first snow and the weight of a season that was trying to push it under. Jess crouched down. She picked it, stem and all, flower number 19. She took it inside and pressed it between the pages of the book. But this time the gesture meant something different, because this time she had not received the flower from Rufus. She had picked it herself. Rufus passed through the kitchen, saw her closing the book, saw the fresh purple between the pages. "You picked that one yourself," he said. "First time." Jess smoothed the book cover with her palm. "Because I am not counting days anymore. I am living here." Rufus smiled. The wide, bright, open Rufus smile that had been the first thing she saw when she arrived on this mountain, exhausted and terrified, and carrying a secret that could have destroyed them all. "That book still has a lot of pages left," he said. Night. The cabin was warm. The fire burned steady and strong, fed with logs that Canton had cut, and Rufus had stacked and Shep had carried inside. Snow fell outside, the second snowfall, thicker than the first, settling on the roof with a sound like someone gently scattering cotton. The trail to Elk Creek would close soon. The mountain was drawing its curtain. 3 men slept. Canton lay on his bed near the front door. On his back, one hand resting on his chest. On that hand, wrapped around the knuckles, was the embroidered handkerchief. White cotton with small flowers stitched along the border in white thread. He had not taken it off. Even in sleep, his hand held the evidence of her care. Rufus lay on his bed by the window, curled on his side. On the table beside him in the same carved wooden cup, a fresh flower. The wild aster that Jess had picked that morning. She had given it to him after pressing the 19th flower into the book. He had put it in water without a word. His mouth curved in a faint smile, the expression of a man who was dreaming about something that made him happy. Shep hung in his hammock, his left hand dangled. On his ring finger, the copper band turned. Slowly, evenly, peacefully. Not the frantic spinning of a man chased by his past. The slow, steady rhythm of a man who had made peace with what he had lost and what he had nearly thrown away, and what by the grace of a woman smarter than him and a family more forgiving than he deserved, he had been allowed to keep. His mouth held the ghost of a smile. the first one he had worn in his sleep in a very long time. In the small room behind the kitchen, Jessamine Alder sat on the wooden floor, her back against the wall, the wedding dress spread across her lap, a candle burning on the tin plate beside her, its light small and gold and steady. In her right hand a needle, not the old needle she had brought from St. Louis, the one with the soft iron shaft that bent when it hit a thick seam. This was one of the needles that Shepherd Pharaoh had forged for her in his workshop 2 weeks ago. Steel, polished, sharp enough to catch light, perfectly balanced between her thumb and forefinger. The man who made this needle had stolen her dress, and then he had brought it back. And now the needle was in her hand, and the dress was on her lap, and the story of betrayal and forgiveness was held in the connection between the tool and the fabric, and the woman who was using one on the other. The lining of the dress lay open before her, the yellowed linen where her mother's map had once been. The space was empty now. The chain stitches that had traced contour lines were gone, burned to ash in the kitchen stove. The satin stitches that had marked streams and ridges were gone. The French knots that had marked the location of a fortune in silver were gone. The false map had been taken north by Shep and was now meaningless, a decoy that had served its purpose and could be forgotten. The linen was blank, waiting. Jess began to sew, not a map, not a code, not a secret that would need to be hidden and protected and feared. Flowers, a chain stitch for the stem, small, curved, growing upward from the base of the linen panel, the way a real stem grows from the earth reaching toward light. A satin stitch for each petal. 5 of them, smooth and close together, the thread laying flat against the fabric, with the luster that only satin stitch could achieve, each petal a small shield of color on the yellowed surface. A French knot for the center, round, golden. The same stitch that had once marked the location of silver now marking the heart of a flower. The same technique, the same movement of the wrist, the same wrap of thread around the needle. But the meaning had changed completely. Wild asters, the flowers that Rufus picked every morning, the flowers that grew in the beds along the cabin path, the flowers she had picked herself that morning, the first one she had chosen rather than received. She was embroidering flowers into the space where the map had been, replacing the treasure with life, replacing silver with petals, replacing the thing that had nearly destroyed her family with the thing that had saved her. And she was doing it with a needle that Shep had made. Steel forged by a man who had given it to her in kindness and then betrayed her, and then returned carrying the dress in one hand and his shame in the other. The needle held that story in its shaft, in the quality of its steel and the sharpness of its point. Every stitch Jess made with it was a stitch of forgiveness woven into the fabric. Tap, tap, tap. The sound filled the small room. The same sound that had opened this story. The same needle against linen. The same woman on the same floor in the same room on the same mountain. But everything else was different. The first time she had sat here, she was reading a map in secret. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking. She was a woman alone with a dangerous secret, surrounded by strangers, counting the days until she would have to run again. Now she was sewing flowers. Her heart was calm. Her hands were steady. She was a woman who had made her choice. The secret was gone. The strangers had become a family. The counting had stopped. Outside her room, the sounds of the cabin settled around her like a second set of walls. The wind on the mountain far away and cold. The fire in the hearth cracking and popping softly. 3 sets of breathing slow and even, the rhythm of men sleeping in a place they had built together and would go on building through winter and beyond. Snow falling on the roof. Light, steady. The sound of the mountain covering itself for winter, sealing the trail, closing the passes, wrapping the 4 people inside this cabin in a silence that was not emptiness, but shelter. Jess stopped sewing. She lifted her head. She listened. All of it. The wind, the fire, the snow, the breathing, the mountain, the night. She smiled. Small, real. She bent her head, and she continued to sew.